In the quiet expanse of Charlotte County, Florida, a young couple set out for what should have been an ordinary family outing. Greg and Kimberly Malnory, both in their mid-20s, were devoted parents, eager to share a simple joy with their 22-month-old daughter, Miranda. A fishing trip, a chance to slow down, to enjoy the warmth of the sun, the stillness of the water. But by the next morning, their world had been shattered. Two lifeless bodies discovered near the water's edge, blood-stained earth, silence hanging thick in the air. And then, inside a truck parked nearby, a child. Alone, dehydrated, covered in bites from a night spent in the darkness, and the silent echoes of an unthinkable tragedy. What happened in those final moments? Who or what turned a peaceful afternoon into a scene of horror? As the investigation unfolded, chilling details would emerge, secrets buried beneath the surface, and a betrayal no one saw coming. This wasn't random. This was calculated. For nearly 3 decades, the search for justice would stretch on: appeals, courtroom battles, a waiting game that tested the limits of the law. Until, finally, the case reached its conclusion. But was it justice, or was it just too late? This is True Crime O'Clock, and you're about to uncover a case that will stay with you long after the story ends. Hit subscribe now, because the truth is always waiting to be told. In the soft light of an early Florida morning in March 1997, we meet Greg Malnory, 25, and Kimberly Malnory, 26, newlyweds whose smiles radiated hope and promise. They were young, full of life, devoted to each other and to their toddler, Miranda, whose gentle laughter was the heartbeat of their world. Every moment with family was cherished, every outing a chance to create memories that would last a lifetime. On this particular morning, the trio set out for what was meant to be a relaxing fishing trip, a simple escape into the natural beauty of the Florida outdoors. The sun rose high and warm, painting the sky in soft hues as they made their way to their favorite spot. Neighbors and local anglers would later recall glimpsing the family, laughing, talking, lost in their own little world. What they didn't know was that someone else was watching. As they arrived at the fishing area, the scene was picture perfect. Greg and Kimberly embraced the moment, setting up their gear, smiling at one another, sharing quiet words between them. There was no rush, no worry, just peace. But beneath that calm exterior, something unseen was moving, something waiting. For those watching, take a moment. Imagine a day so ordinary, so routine, that you'd never expect it to become a turning point in a life marked by loss. If you're here with us on True Crime O'Clock, don't forget to hit subscribe for more chilling stories that demand to be told. And then, the last known moments began to unfold. A few local witnesses later recalled seeing Greg and Kimberly at the water's edge, completely at ease, absorbed in conversation. Then, a brief pause. Something was said, something small, perhaps insignificant at the time, a moment before everything changed. Stay with us, because in the next chapter, the warmth of that Florida afternoon is about to be shattered by an act so brutal it would haunt this town for decades. What happened next will leave you questioning how well we truly know the moments that shape our lives. The Florida sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden hues across the water's surface. The Malnorys, immersed in their peaceful afternoon, were completely unaware of the figure watching them. Waiting. James Ford, 36 years old, a man with a violent past. But on this day, he was something else entirely, a threat waiting to strike. He had worked alongside Greg at the sod farm, but today, work was far from his mind. A firearm in his possession, thoughts only he would ever fully understand. Somewhere along the shoreline, he made his move. Greg may have sensed something, perhaps a shift in the air, a fleeting moment of unease. But by the time he registered the presence behind him, it was too late. Greg falls to the ground, his body collapsing near the water's edge. Kimberly screams, her voice cutting through the open landscape, a sound that would haunt anyone who heard it. But Ford isn't finished. Not yet. Kimberly, desperate, cradles her child, instinctively shielding her. She pleads, words lost in the growing terror, but there is no mercy in Ford's expression, no hesitation in his next move. Kimberly stumbles. The agony of the wound sends her to the ground, but she is still alive, still fighting, still breathing. But he doesn't stop at gunfire. He wants certainty. A blunt object, perhaps the butt of his gun, perhaps something heavier, comes down on Greg's skull again and again. The violence is merciless. Kimberly's last moments, a desperate attempt to crawl toward her child, an outstretched hand, her voice a whisper of her daughter's name. And then stillness, a crime so vicious, so personal, yet only one witness remains. A 22-month-old child covered in her mother's blood, trapped in a world she cannot understand. The sun fades, giving way to an empty night. The only sounds now are the distant croaks of frogs, the occasional splash of a fish, and the faint, exhausted cries of a child, alone. Hours pass. Darkness stretches on, morning arrives, and with it, an unexpected visitor. Someone approaches the scene, footsteps against damp earth. And then a gasp, a shout for help. The nightmare has been discovered. What followed next would launch a manhunt, an investigation, and years of unanswered questions. Who was James Ford? Why had he done this? And was he already slipping away? In the next chapter, the search begins. The chase is on, but the clock is ticking. This is True Crime O'Clock, and this is only the beginning. Stay with us. The first to stumble upon the scene was a local fisherman. He had arrived at the water's edge that morning, as he had many times before, expecting the usual stillness, the usual quiet. But this time, something was wrong. A body, motionless, blood pooling into the dirt, and then another. A woman, lifeless, her arms reaching as if in a final effort to protect something. And then the sound, faint, weak, a small cry from inside a truck, parked just feet away. A child. She had survived the night, alone, dehydrated, covered in insect bites, and the unmistakable evidence of a nightmare no child should endure. Within hours, the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office had arrived. Officers roped off the area. Crime scene tape stretched across the landscape. Investigators worked in silence, moving with the precision that only experience brings. But there was something heavier in the air that day, something unspoken. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was something else. The news spread quickly. A small town, now frozen in shock. 2 young parents executed, a child left behind, and the most unsettling question of all: who did this? Forensic teams moved in, carefully collecting evidence, bullet casings, blood samples, shoe prints in the dirt. But it was the sheer brutality of the attack that left them shaken. The bodies weren't just shot, they were bludgeoned. The killer hadn't just wanted them dead, he wanted to erase them. As they examined the bodies, a disturbing realization settled over them. This wasn't random, this was personal. Detectives sifted through records, looking for any leads. And then a name, James Ford, a farm worker, someone Greg knew, someone who had been at the sod farm that very day, and someone with a past. Ford had a violent history, assault charges, disturbing behavior, a pattern of aggression, but now he was nowhere to be found. The manhunt had begun. Authorities scoured the area, but Ford had disappeared. It was as if he had melted into the Florida heat, leaving only the echoes of his crime behind. Time was slipping away. The longer he stayed hidden, the harder he would be to catch. But investigators weren't giving up, because justice wasn't just an option. It was inevitable. In the next chapter, the pursuit intensifies. A break in the case brings them closer than ever. But what happens when a man like James Ford knows he's being hunted? This is True Crime O'Clock, and the chase is far from over. Stay with us. James Ford had vanished. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, but no one forgot his name. Law enforcement combed through every lead, questioned co-workers, scoured the sod farm, followed every possible trail. But Ford was slippery, experienced in evasion, until one phone call changed everything. An anonymous tip, a voice calm, deliberate, giving an address, a location where Ford had been seen. The caller didn't say much, didn't want to be involved, but the message was clear. James Ford wasn't as far as they thought. The takedown was swift. Officers surrounded a small, rundown apartment in Arcadia, Florida. They moved in cautiously, weapons drawn, knowing exactly who was inside. And then there he was, James Ford, sitting at a wooden table, hands resting on his lap. No panic, no resistance, just waiting. The officers moved in, handcuffs locked into place. But what they saw when they looked into his eyes? No anger, no remorse. Just a blank, emotionless stare, as if what he had done meant nothing. Then came the trial. The courtroom was packed. Victims' family, reporters, townspeople. All still struggling to comprehend how such brutality had unfolded in their quiet corner of Florida. The prosecution laid it out in stark detail. The forensic evidence, the bullets, the blunt force trauma, the sheer savagery of the crime. They played the 911 call, showed images of the crime scene. And then the testimony that silenced the room, a doctor describing the toddler, Miranda, barely 2 years old, found in the truck, dehydrated, blood-streaked. Her parents stolen from her before she could even form memories of them. The jury took little time. Guilty. The death sentence was handed down, and James Ford just sat there. No last words, no reaction, no apology, as if it had all been just another day. But the story wasn't over yet, because in the American justice system, a death sentence isn't always swift. In the next chapter, decades of legal battles, appeals, delays, and a family still waiting for justice to be served. This is True Crime O'Clock, and justice doesn't always come quickly, but sometimes it comes. James Ford had been sentenced to death, but in the American legal system, that sentence wasn't immediate. Years passed, then decades. Ford's attorneys filed appeal after appeal, challenging his conviction, questioning the evidence, arguing against execution. They claimed he was intellectually disabled, that he didn't understand his actions, that he shouldn't be put to death. The courts rejected these arguments over and over, but each appeal bought him more time than Greg and Kimberly Malnory ever got. For the Malnory family, it was a cruel cycle: the pain of loss, the promise of justice, then another legal roadblock. Kimberly's sister, in every interview, spoke of the weight her family carried. They wanted closure. They wanted Ford to face the punishment he had earned. But the years stretched on, until finally the waiting ended. January 10th, 2025. Governor Ron DeSantis signed James Ford's death warrant. The execution was set. There would be no more delays, no more appeals, no more running. February 15th, 2025, Florida State Prison. Ford was led to the execution chamber, strapped to a gurney, IV lines inserted. Reporters and witnesses took their seats, watching through the thick pane of glass. The room fell silent. When asked for his last words, he said nothing. No apology, no explanation, not a single acknowledgement of the lives he had stolen. At 6:14 p.m., James Ford was pronounced dead. After nearly 3 decades, justice had finally been carried out. For Greg and Kimberly's loved ones, it wasn't about revenge. It was about finally closing a chapter, about ensuring that the man who had stolen so much from them would never see another day of freedom. But closure isn't always simple, because what happens after justice is served? What happens to those left behind? In the next chapter, we look at the aftermath, the scars left behind, and the question that lingers for every victim's family. Does justice ever truly heal the wounds of loss? This is True Crime O'Clock, and the story isn't over yet. A peaceful fishing trip, a young couple in love, and a life forever changed. Greg and Kimberly Malnory were just beginning their journey together. Newlyweds, parents, building a future. They had no reason to fear that a colleague, someone familiar, would be the one to end it all. But that's the truth about real monsters. They don't always come from the shadows. Sometimes they sit beside us, shake our hands, share our spaces. James Ford is dead. His execution marked the end of a legal battle that spanned 28 years. But was it justice? The death penalty has long been debated. Some say it brings closure. Others argue it only extends suffering. The Malnory family waited nearly 3 decades for this moment. They saw the system at work, slow, unrelenting, and at times agonizing. The legal system gave Ford more time than Greg and Kimberly ever had. That is a fact. Miranda Malnory, the baby who survived that night, grew up without the parents who should have been there for her first steps, her first words, her milestones. She was left with questions that could never truly be answered. and scars that time can never erase. So we ask again, was justice served or was it simply delayed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. If you found this case haunting, disturbing, and unforgettable, hit the like button. It helps bring more stories like this to light. And if you haven't already, subscribe to True Crime O'Clock, because the truth is always waiting to be uncovered.